Thomas had been walking for days, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a small sack of provisions that were slowly running out. His feet were sore, his body weary, and his mind heavy with uncertainty. He had no real destination, just the hope that he would find a place to rest. And maybe, just maybe, someone who would offer him a job. Times were tough, and he had not been able to find work for weeks. The world seemed vast and empty, and the roads stretched endlessly ahead of him, but the small, quiet village he was nearing held a flicker of hope. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky as he entered the village. The warm, golden light reflected off the thatched roofs of the cottages, and the air carried the faint scent of wildflowers and freshly baked bread. The village was peaceful, with people going about their business, tending to gardens, repairing fences, and chatting with neighbors. It was a sharp contrast to the loneliness Thomas had been feeling on his journey. He had heard whispers of a widow living on the outskirts of the village, a woman named Margaret. The rumors painted her as someone tough, unyielding, but also kind-hearted beneath it all. She had lost her husband some years ago and had been living alone ever since. People said she was particular about who she trusted, and that she didn't take kindly to strangers, but that she sometimes hired help for small jobs around her house. If there was any chance for work, it was with her. With his hopes slightly raised, Thomas made his way toward the cottage at the edge of the village. The cottage was simple, tucked away among the trees, and surrounded by a small, well-kept garden. As he approached, he noticed the gate was open, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed from within. He took a deep breath, wiped his brow, and stepped up to the door, ready to make his plea for work. He raised his hand and knocked softly. For a moment, there was no response. The silence hung in the air, and Thomas wondered if anyone was home. He was about to turn away when he heard the sound of footsteps inside, growing louder. The door creaked open slowly, and there stood a woman in her mid-40s, her hair dark but streaked with silver, tied up in a loose bun. Her face, though soft, carried a certain quiet strength, and her eyes, though tired, seemed sharp and observant. She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust him or send him on his way. Her gaze was steady, and Thomas felt a twinge of nervousness. He hadn't expected to be met with such intensity. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice warm but measured. Thomas, trying to maintain his composure, cleared his throat. "I'm sorry to trouble you, ma'am. I've been traveling for days, and I'm looking for any work I can find. I'll do anything, really. If you need help with repairs or anything around the house, I'd be grateful for the opportunity." Margaret studied him for a moment longer, as if weighing his sincerity. She seemed to be considering something. Maybe his request. Maybe something else. Then, after a long silence, she spoke again. "I suppose I could use some help around here," she said, her voice softening just a touch. "But I don't just hire anyone, you know. People come here looking for work, but few stick around long enough to actually help. And I don't like having strangers in my home unless I know they'll be of use." Thomas nodded quickly. "I understand, ma'am. I'll do whatever you need. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm not here to cause trouble." Margaret eyed him for another few seconds, as if trying to decide whether he was trustworthy or just another traveler looking for a quick way out of his troubles. But something in his earnest expression seemed to make her soften. She stepped aside and motioned for him to enter. "Well, if you're serious about work, come in. But don't get any ideas about staying here for free. I don't make exceptions for anyone." Thomas stepped over the threshold into the cottage, which was surprisingly cozy. The small space was filled with the scent of fresh herbs and the soft crackle of a fire in the hearth. The walls were lined with books, trinkets, and hand-woven tapestries, all adding to the warmth of the room. Despite the small size, the place felt lived in, full of stories and memories that Margaret had gathered over the years. She led him to a wooden table near the fireplace. "Sit down. Let's see what you can do." Thomas hesitated for a moment, unsure of what she expected. "I'm happy to help however I can. I don't have much experience with anything specific, But I can chop wood, clean, fix things whatever you need. Margaret looked at him, then slowly nodded, as though she had already decided. I have a garden that needs tending, and there's some firewood that needs to be chopped. If you can do that, then we'll see about more work later. Thomas nodded gratefully, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The work might be simple, but it would give him a place to rest, a roof over his head, and a chance to regain his strength. He followed her to the back of the cottage, where a small garden sat behind a low stone wall. The plants were healthy, but the weeds had overrun certain patches, and the vegetables needed tending. Margaret showed him the tools he would need, and gave him a brief rundown of how she liked things done. Be careful with the tomatoes, they need attention, and don't forget to water the herbs. They're the most delicate. Thomas took the spade and began to work, feeling the strain in his muscles, but also the satisfaction of doing something productive. Margaret watched from a distance for a while, then returned inside, leaving him to his work. The silence between them was comfortable, and Thomas found himself relaxing for the first time in days. He was grateful for the small task, and as he worked, he found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, he could make a life here, even if it was only for a while. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the cottage. Margaret came out again, this time with a basket of freshly baked bread and a pot of soup. I've made some food. You'll need your strength if you're going to work here, she said, offering the food to him. Thomas, grateful, accepted the meal. They ate in silence, the quiet only broken by the sounds of the village settling down for the night. Margaret had a way of making even the simplest moments feel significant, and Thomas found himself appreciating her company more than he expected. He had never met anyone like her, someone so strong yet so reserved, someone who seemed to carry the weight of her past without letting it crush her. After dinner, Margaret stood up and looked out into the distance. There's more work to be done tomorrow, she said quietly. But for now, you can rest. I'll give you a room in the attic. Thomas, feeling a mix of gratitude and curiosity, nodded. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he might have found a place to stay, if only for a while. Margaret's offer of work was not just about giving him a job, it was about something more. It was about trust, about the possibility of a new beginning for both of them. He could sense that there was more to her story, something deeper, something she hadn't shared. But for now, he was content to stay and help, hoping that whatever came next, he would be ready for it. As the evening settled in, and the last rays of sunlight faded, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this unexpected turn of events would lead to something more than just a temporary job. Maybe it would lead to a new chapter in both of their lives. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the village, Thomas settled in for a quiet night. Margaret led him up the narrow stairs to the attic, where a small room awaited him. It was basic but comfortable, a simple bed, a wooden chair, and a small window that framed a perfect view of the surrounding hills. He had seen many inns and barns in his travels, but this place felt different. It was not luxurious, but there was something welcoming about the room, something that made him feel as if he were finally resting in a place that could be home, even if only for a short time. As he lay down on the bed, the events of the day replayed in his mind. Meeting Margaret had been a strange experience. There was something about her calm demeanor, her directness, that made him feel both at ease and uneasy at the same time. He had expected her to be more guarded, perhaps even cold, given the stories he had heard about her. But she had been kind, offering him work without hesitation, and even preparing him a meal later on. Thomas wondered about the widow's life, about the story behind her solitude, and why she had stayed so isolated after the death of her husband. But these thoughts were pushed aside as the exhaustion from the day caught up with him. He closed his eyes, hoping to sleep and gather strength for whatever the next day would bring. Morning came sooner than he expected. The early sunlight filtered through the small attic window, and the sounds of birds chirping outside stirred Thomas from his sleep. He stretched, feeling a slight ache in his muscles from the previous day's work, but the good kind of ache, the kind that reminded him he had earned his rest. He knew he had a full day of work ahead of him, and he felt ready for it. When he went downstairs, Margaret was already busy in the kitchen. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air, and the crackling of a fire in the hearth added a comforting warmth to the space. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. "Good morning," she said simply, not turning away from the fire where she stirred a pot. "The garden still needs some work, and the firewood has to be chopped." "There's always something to do around here." Thomas nodded, eager to begin his tasks. "I'm ready. Whatever you need." Margaret handed him a small loaf of bread and a bowl of soup. "Eat. You'll need your strength. Then we can get to work." The food was simple but delicious, and Thomas ate in silence, grateful for the nourishment. There was no rush in Margaret's demeanor, no urgency. She seemed content in her own world, comfortable in the routine of her day-to-day life. And yet, there was a subtle sense of control in the way she moved, like someone who had been managing things alone for a long time. Once breakfast was over, Margaret led him outside to the garden, where the morning sun now bathed everything in a warm glow. It was a peaceful sight, the neat rows of plants, the flowers blooming in vibrant colors, and the soft hum of bees busy at work. The garden had a quiet beauty, and it was clear that Margaret had put a lot of time and effort into keeping it in good shape. "There's a patch over there that needs weeding," Margaret said, pointing to a section near the back of the garden, "and the tomatoes are growing well, but they need attention. You can start with that, and I'll be inside, cleaning up." Thomas nodded, taking the small rake she handed him. He stepped over to the area she had pointed to and began working, pulling up weeds and clearing the soil around the plants. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice how peaceful it all felt. There were no demands on him here, no deadlines, no expectations beyond the simple task at hand. The rhythmic motion of working in the garden had a calming effect on him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of belonging, even if it was just in this small corner of the world. As he worked, Margaret returned to the house, leaving him alone to finish his task. He didn't mind the solitude. In fact, he welcomed it. There was something about the quiet that allowed his mind to wander. He thought about his journey, how he had come to this village, and how much he had learned about the world outside his own. His life had always been one of uncertainty, moving from place to place, looking for work, struggling to find a home. But here, in this little cottage with this quiet woman, he had found something he hadn't expected, a sense of stability. But there was still a question that lingered in his mind. Why had Margaret offered him work in the first place? He had heard she was a private person, not one to easily trust strangers, so why had she taken him in so quickly? He wasn't sure if he would ever get an answer, but the thought of it kept him curious. By mid-afternoon, he had finished his work in the garden and began chopping the firewood, as Margaret had asked. The task was simple, but it required focus, and he didn't mind it. As he split the logs with the axe, he could hear the rhythmic thud of the wood hitting the ground, and the soft rustling of the trees around him in the breeze. It was a sound he had come to appreciate during his time in the village, the peaceful sounds of life going on around him. When he finished, he stacked the firewood neatly beside the cottage, his muscles sore but satisfied with the work he had done. Margaret had been inside most of the day, but now she emerged, her apron still on, though the kitchen was tidied and the air smelled of something new, something sweet. "You've done well," she said, nodding approvingly at the neatly stacked wood. "It's not easy work, but it's good work." Thomas smiled, grateful for the compliment. "Thank you. It feels good to be doing something useful." Margaret looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "I've lived here alone for a long time," she said quietly, "and while I don't mind solitude, it can get lonely. It's nice to have someone here, even if just for a little while." Thomas was surprised by her admission. He had expected her to remain distant, but there was a vulnerability in her voice, a hint of the woman she had once been before her husband's death. He hadn't known what to expect when he first arrived at the cottage. But now, as he looked at her, he realized that she was more than just the strong, independent woman she appeared to be. There was a depth to her, a complexity he hadn't anticipated. For the rest of the evening, they ate together, talking only in small bursts. There was something unspoken between them, a quiet understanding that neither of them was ready to put into words. They were two people, each with their own pasts, each with their own reasons for being in this place at this time. Later, as the sun began to set, Margaret looked out the window and sighed softly. Tomorrow, there's more work to be done. But for tonight, I suppose we rest. Thomas nodded, feeling both grateful and uncertain about what the next day would bring. He was beginning to realize that there was more to this place, more to Margaret, than he had first assumed. Whatever had started as a simple arrangement was slowly growing into something more complex, something neither of them had expected. And as the evening fell into a quiet calm, Thomas couldn't help but wonder, what would tomorrow bring? And what would happen next? The next few days followed a rhythm that was simple but soothing. Thomas woke up early, greeted by the soft light of the morning creeping through the window. Margaret had already begun her day, preparing breakfast and going about her usual routine. There was a calmness about the house that Thomas had come to appreciate. He no longer felt like an outsider, but rather like part of the daily ebb and flow of life in the cottage. Margaret had always been efficient and direct in everything she did, and it was clear that her life, though solitary, was well ordered. She had tasks to complete, chores to manage, and despite her occasional silence, there was a quiet sense of pride in the way she handled everything. Thomas began to understand the deep care she put into her life. Even if she didn't express it through grand gestures or words, there was a beauty in the way she moved through the world, quietly taking care of everything around her, never needing validation, never seeking attention. Each day, Thomas worked harder, focusing on the tasks at hand. He cleared the fields, mended fences, and chopped more wood. It wasn't the work that kept him busy. It was the steady rhythm of doing something productive. In all his travels, he had never stayed in one place long enough to get used to the slow, repetitive tasks of daily life. But here, in the quiet of the cottage, he found himself looking forward to the simplicity. There was a sense of purpose that had eluded him for years. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they would sit together by the fire. Margaret didn't say much, but there was something in the way she looked at him, something that made Thomas feel seen. They would eat in silence, occasionally exchanging a few words about the day's work or the weather. But the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, a silence full of understanding. But there was something more beneath the surface, something that both of them were aware of but had yet to acknowledge. They had settled into a routine that was easy and comfortable, but neither of them had ever said much about why they had come to this point. Margaret had invited him into her home, offered him work, and treated him with a kind of quiet hospitality. And Thomas, though grateful, had never asked why she had chosen to trust him so quickly, or why she had offered him something more than just a job. He wondered if she was still carrying the weight of her late husband's memory, or if she had begun to see him as more than just a temporary helper. One afternoon, as Thomas was working in the garden, Margaret came outside with a basket of herbs and wildflowers. She was wearing her usual simple dress, her hair loosely tied back. The breeze was gentle, and the sun warmed the earth as she approached him. Her steps slow but deliberate. "Thomas," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I want to talk to you about something." Thomas wiped his brow with the back of his hand, trying to hide the surprise in his eyes. Margaret wasn't someone who often initiated conversations beyond the day's work. He straightened up, looking at her with curiosity. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his tone casual, but his heart racing slightly in anticipation. Margaret hesitated for a moment. Glancing down at the flowers in her basket, she seemed lost in thought for a moment before meeting his gaze. "I've been thinking. You've been here for a while now, and things have become comfortable. But I never asked you why you came to this village. I never asked what it is you're running from, or if you even have anywhere else to go." Her question caught him off guard. He hadn't expected to be asked about his past, especially not by her. He shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. The truth was, he didn't know exactly what he was running from, or if he was running at all. He had simply been moving, searching for something to fill the emptiness he had felt for so long. I don't really know," he admitted after a moment, choosing his words carefully. I've been moving from place to place for as long as I can remember. I suppose I was looking for work, something to do. I never really thought about staying anywhere for long. It's just how I've lived. Margaret nodded, as though she understood, her eyes thoughtful. I know what it's like to feel like you don't have a place. I've been here, alone, for a long time now. Sometimes it feels like the days blur together, and you forget what it's like to have someone to share them with. Her words were quiet, but they carried a weight that made Thomas pause. He wasn't sure why, but he suddenly felt a deep sympathy for her. Margaret had lived with a kind of loneliness he hadn't fully understood until now. Her husband was gone, and she had remained in this small cottage, keeping to herself, finding solace in the work she did around the house and garden. But there was a sadness in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before, something that lingered in the way she held herself. Like she was waiting for something. But she wasn't sure what. I didn't mean to pry, Margaret added quickly, as though realizing she had said too much. She started to turn back toward the house, but Thomas called out to her. No, he said. It's okay. You're not prying. He paused for a moment, unsure of whether he should speak any further. There was a part of him that wanted to open up, to share more about his own past, to explain why he kept moving from place to place, never staying long enough to form any real connections. But for some reason, he couldn't bring himself to do it. He wasn't sure he was ready to put his own emotions into words just yet. Instead, he looked at Margaret and smiled, a small, reassuring smile. I think we're both just trying to find our way. Margaret looked back at him, her gaze soft. Maybe that's true, she said quietly, before turning and walking toward the house. The moment passed, and things returned to normal, at least on the surface. They continued to work together, each focusing on their tasks, yet an unspoken bond had formed between them. There was a quiet understanding, a shared sense of longing for something more that neither of them had been able to articulate. And as the days went on, Thomas found himself becoming more attuned to Margaret's presence, her quiet strength, her determination, and the way she moved through life with such grace and resilience. These were the things that began to draw him in. He realized that his feelings for her were growing, but it was complicated. They had started as strangers, but now there was something more, something neither of them had planned for. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Margaret glanced at him, her eyes a little distant. You know, she said softly, I never expected this. To have someone here, helping me, sharing these days. It's strange, but it feels good. Thomas smiled, his heart warmed by her words. He understood exactly what she meant. It had been a long time since he had felt this way, like he was part of something. Even if only for a moment. He wasn't sure where this strange partnership was heading, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't ready to leave. And so, they continued, each of them silently acknowledging the change that had begun between them. Both were hesitant to speak the words that lingered in their hearts. But deep down, they both knew that something was growing, something that could change everything. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the bond between Margaret and Thomas grew deeper. The work they did together seemed to blend into the rhythm of their daily lives, and with each task, a sense of familiarity settled over the cottage. Though neither of them spoke about it directly, there was an understanding between them that things had changed. Their marriage, once a strange agreement born out of necessity, had evolved into something different, something unspoken but undeniable. Thomas found himself looking forward to each new day. It was no longer just about the work. It was about spending time with Margaret. Her quiet strength and independence had captivated him from the start. And the more he learned about her, the more he admired her. She had been through so much: the loss of her husband, years of solitude, and yet she continued on, finding purpose in the simple things. It was something Thomas had never quite understood before. He had always moved from place to place, never really staying anywhere long enough to form any real roots. But now, in this small corner of the world, with Margaret, he was starting to understand the power of staying, of building a life out of the ordinary. One afternoon, after they had finished tending the garden together, Thomas sat on the porch, looking out over the fields. The warm breeze blew through the trees, and the sound of birds chirping filled the air. Margaret came outside, a basket of freshly picked vegetables in her hands, and sat next to him on the porch steps. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sat in the quiet, comfortable silence that had become a familiar part of their routine. "I was thinking," Margaret said softly, breaking the silence. "You've been here for a while now. And I know I've said it before, but I want to thank you for your help. You've done more for me than I could have ever asked for." Thomas glanced at her, surprised by the emotion in her voice. She rarely spoke like this, always keeping her thoughts close to her chest. But there was something in her tone now that made his heart stir. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice low. "I've enjoyed being here. It's nice. Having a place to work, a place to belong." Margaret's eyes softened as she looked at him, her gaze searching his face. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The words they wanted to speak were just on the tip of their tongues, but neither of them knew how to say them. Margaret finally broke the silence, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "Do you ever think about staying here? Permanently?" "I mean," Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected that question. Not in the way she had asked it. He had thought about staying, of course. But the idea of making it permanent, of tying himself to this place, to her, was something he had never truly allowed himself to consider. "I don't know," he said, his voice unsteady. "I've never stayed in one place long enough to think about it. I never really thought I'd find a place where I wanted to stay, but—" He paused, looking out over the fields again, gathering his thoughts. "But there's something here, something about this place, about you, that makes me feel like I could." Margaret's face softened, and she nodded slowly, as though she understood exactly what he meant. "I know what you mean," she said. "I've spent so many years alone here. I thought I was fine with it. But then you came, and things are different now." Thomas looked at her, his heart racing. There was something in the way she said those words that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, there was something more between them than just the work they had shared. He had grown fond of her, more than he had ever expected. And as much as he tried to ignore it, the feelings had only grown stronger with each passing day. "I don't know what the future holds," Thomas said softly. "But I know that, for the first time in a long time, I'm not running anymore." Margaret didn't answer immediately, but she didn't need to. Her eyes told him everything he needed to know. There was something unspoken between them. Something that neither of them had said aloud, but that had always been there, growing quietly, like the plants they tended together. It was a bond formed not from necessity, but from understanding, from shared experiences, and from the simple act of caring for one another. As the days passed, the seasons began to change. The crisp air of fall settled in, bringing with it a sense of change. The trees turned vibrant shades of orange and red, and the fields stretched out before them, ripe for harvest. It was a time of transition, a time when the earth slowed down and prepared for the quiet of winter. And in the same way, Thomas and Margaret's relationship had slowed down, deepened, and transformed. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Margaret turned to Thomas, her face serious. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but soft, "about what you said, about staying here. And I think I'd like that. I'd like it if you stayed. But I don't want you to feel like you have to. I don't want to pressure you into anything." Thomas reached out, taking her hand gently in his. "I don't feel pressured. I didn't know how to say it before. But now, I think I know what I want." He squeezed her hand. "I want to stay. I want to be here with you." Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with warmth, and for the first time in a long while, a small smile tugged at her lips. It was a smile that spoke volumes of trust, of hope, and of the quiet understanding they had built between them. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the comfortable silence. The crackling of the fire, the only sound in the room. The next morning, Thomas woke up with a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. It was as if everything in his life had led him to this point, to this small cottage, to Margaret, to the life they were beginning to build together. It wasn't a grand love story, filled with dramatic moments or sweeping gestures. It was something simpler, something quieter, but no less meaningful. Margaret had become more than just a widow he had helped out of necessity. She had become someone he cared for deeply, someone he admired for her strength and resilience. And in return, she had become a companion, a friend, and perhaps, in time, something even more. As he walked outside that morning, the crisp air filling his lungs, Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for the future. There was work to be done, of course. But there was also something more. Something that neither of them had expected when they first met, but that they now both recognized as the foundation of something beautiful. They had found something together that was built on trust, on quiet companionship, and on the willingness to stay, to be present, and to see where this journey would lead, whatever the future held. Thomas knew one thing for sure. This was no longer just a temporary arrangement. It was a life they had chosen to build together.